something I always find really funny on Radio 4 when they have a guest, and what they want to do is immediately start talking about the thing, and the person goes, "Hi, thank you for having me." And they go, "Yeah, yeah."
Yeah.
That's not the etiquette.
I would be Guy Gomer.
The cab driver who was ushered on.
And there was rumours it was going to be made into a film. But how would you make that into a film? It's just
That's not got a 3-act structure, is it?
Netflix, they'll do it.
Comic Cuts. We're looking at a panel, and we comprise a panel. There's a few of us. So the panel sees a panel, and we talk about the comics from the panel we discuss, and we call it Comic Cuts. I'm Kev F Sutherland, and my guests today are Steve Otis Gunn and Andrew O'Neill.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
I was expecting a sound. Thank you. You didn't disappoint.
Oh, I've got a sound. Do you want a sound? I've got one.
Oh, go on.
There you go. You want that one?
No. Welcome to Comic Cuts, your favourite podcast about comics. Don't worry if you don't know or care anything about comics. Half the time, neither do my guests, and it doesn't hurt. My two guests have brought with them a panel from a comic or something close, and we're going to see if we can identify it and talk about it. Maybe we'll learn something about comics and our guests, or maybe we'll just show off a bit and have fun. Let's see. Andrew, Steve, I've met both of you up in the legendary Edinburgh. Steve, you were in a very different role back then. You were my technician.
That's right. Yeah. I was. I was. I always loved comedy. Always was into comedy. And at the time, when was that? It was 2016. I was working on. Excuse the name drop. Darren Brown's show, and I remember being on tour and thinking, I really want to go to Edinburgh, but I don't know how to get in. So I just sort of sent my CV to everybody, and a lot of them came back and said, "Why would you want to do that? You're already doing sound for like big acts." But I always loved it, and I thought, you know what? And it turned out to be one of the best jobs I ever had because it was just so much fun. And I was lucky that my first ever room there was just like every act was just superb. Maybe not the place, let's not talk about those, but everything else was really, really good.
It was, listener, a marvellous venue called the Gilded Balloon, which we all love. But the thing about those rooms is that they're very, very hot. Andrew, you've played a lot of hot rooms in Edinburgh and wearing makeup as well, which can't be a good combination.
Well, I don't do the full thing. I don't wear foundation and stuff because that just does slide off. So yeah, you have to be adaptive. It's like the makeup you would wear on holiday. That's what you end up having to do. But I do occasionally wearing the same thing every day. Like there was a point I was at Monkey Bar a couple of years ago. I was like, this room really smells, and I realised it was the dress that I hadn't cleaned in 2 weeks. Shit, it's me.
The Edinburgh Fringe is a thing that, if you've not been, it's a hard thing to explain to civilians because it's called the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So people expect a thing with tents in fields, and that's not what you get, is it?
No, you get ad hoc conference rooms covered in thick black material, and then with incredibly hot lights installed.
And then people like me trying to work out the aircon situation for said acts, which is either extremely loud and doesn't work, or is really loud and does work, but then you literally got nobody can hear the act. So
yeah,
I actually progressed to production manager in that job, and then I always joke that it basically was aircon manager. That was the job. It was all about aircon. That's all it was, keeping the acts from melting.
Very much, because it's Edinburgh in August, which compared to most of the rest of Europe is probably one of the cooler parts of Europe until you get inside a place where people are trying to perform comedy, and then it is an absolute sauna. But Steve, you were behind the desk and then you moved to the other side of the desk with an appropriate title for the show. You called the show Steve Gunn is Uncomfortable. Was it just the aircon?
No, it was. I was trying to come up with a name, and originally it was Steve Otis Gunn is No Good, because I came from basically it was because around the time I met you, Kev, I was actually writing a book which then got published, and then I turned that book into a sort of one-man show stroke comedy show, which I tried to perform. I did all right, got 4 stars, but it wasn't comedy. It was very much theatre, I think, in the end. But I really enjoyed performing it. We had good rooms. Occasionally there'd be very strange rooms with people not understanding what I was doing. But I had a great time, and it was nice to step onto that side of the sort of, carpet, if you know what I mean. I'd always wanted to perform. I'd been a musician before. I've been doing the podcast for a couple of years, so it felt natural to give it a shot. So I did that.
Well, yeah, music runs through both of your veins, doesn't it? Because Andrew, music comes in a lot to what you've done. I mean, we know you from the Radio 4 sitcom Damned Andrew. You're the author of History of Heavy Metal, and you do a lot of the music festivals. I mean, you do Glastonbury, you do Reading and Leeds, you've done Download. Can they even hear you at Download?
Oh, yeah, they've got really good PA systems.
Are you doing comedy there or music?
Well, I've done both. So my old band, the Men That Will Not Be Blamed for Nothing, played the second stage at Download about maybe 10 years ago. And in fact, tomorrow I'm doing my History of Punk, my new show, one of my new shows, at Download. And at Download, the comedy happens in the sort of campsite entertainment area. It's called District X. So it's not in the main arena. And basically tomorrow I'm playing for all the nerds that have turned up early.
There's a big nerd overlap, isn't there, between our comedy area and the music area? I mean, you've done punk and you've done heavy metal. When I grew up, and I am older than you guys, it was never the twain. I was an NME reader, so it was all punk and new wave, and heavy metal was something that you either didn't talk about or just laughed at. I mean, do you bring the two worlds together quite comfortably, Andrew?
Well, they massively overlap from the early 80s. I mean, when you get into what's called the UK 82 stuff, so Exploited, GBH and Discharge, I mean, those guys start using metal as an influence. I mean, very particularly Discharge. And then there's the crust punk scene with bands like Amoebics that are very clearly influenced by kind of Black Sabbath and kind of thrashier stuff. And then thrash metal, so Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, they're massively influenced by hardcore punk. So it all kind of crossbreeds, and they throughout the sort of 70s and 80s they were separate tribes, but they absolutely crossbred. So, and growing up, I was first a metalhead, and then very quickly got into New York hardcore bands like Sick of It All, and grindcore. So Napalm Death are absolutely kind of at the apex of both extreme metal and extreme punk. I mean, grindcore entirely comes from punk. But it sounds very, very similar to death metal. And then Napalm started getting into death metal and it all kind of crossed over. So they overlap, but I found that the shows are very different. Because with the metal show, because metalheads are basically dogs and very so you basically go Slayer and they go, hey! And with punks are much more individualistic, much more choosy, and punks have their own individual areas of knowledge and of, it's the bands they like, it's their mates' bands, it's the little scene that they're part of, because punk is so much more a social thing, and it's a counterculture, so it's about politics, and it's about activism, and, zines and that sort of culture. So what I find with the punk show is the references land in really different ways, depending what bit I'm talking about, depending what era I'm talking about. With the metal show, I did it chronologically, but with the punk show, I keep all the basically 76, 77 British stuff till the very end.
Right.
Because that's what everyone's waiting for. If I did it chronologically, that would be the beginning, and then the end, I'd be talking about Amel and the Sniffers and things like that, which doesn't have the same resonance, Well,
yeah, to a civilian like myself, or an old person like myself, 76, 77 punk is what I call punk. Yeah. And then when punk was followed by new wave, I was one of the generation for whom they had to come up with the phrase "punk's not dead," because I thought punk was dead.
Yeah. No, and it absolutely. The thing is, John Robb says this amazing thing in his book that punk never went away. It just became so much a part of culture you couldn't see it anymore. And I think the influence of punk in terms of like its attitude and its approach is there. But also with those bands like, it's Exploited that wrote the song "Punk's Not Dead," and in the 80s you've got Crass, who sold thousands and hundreds of thousands of records, and they took the politics that the Sex Pistols talked about in a very superficial way. They took it very, very seriously. And the influence of that, and then in America you've got the hardcore scene, so Black Flag, Minor Threat, all that sort of stuff. That was a huge scene. And then there's a resurgence of that in New York in the sort of later 80s. And it's not only is it never gone away, but it's become much more interesting and much more variated. And it's one of the things that always annoys me about those documentaries that are made by people of a certain age, where it's pretty much, the Pistols split up and then Nirvana. That's pretty much how they go. Yeah, okay. But in between that, you've got the Minutemen, and you've got Deep Wound, and you've got all these bands that forged an independent scene with labels and with independent touring, DIY touring, which led to that rise of grunge and all that sort of thing. Grunge is just the emergence into the mainstream of something that had been absolutely huge in the underground in America in the 80s.
And I think the American-British divide might be a significant thing, because I remember when Nirvana came along, and I've got that NME with the front cover that says Nirvana, the Guns N' Roses, It's Okay to Like.
Stunning, yeah, right, okay. There's a sort of, because, obviously, punk originated in America with MC5 and the Stooges, and then you've got the CBGB scene, so you've got like Television and Blondie, Talking Heads, Velvet Underground, Suicide. Suicide are the first band to call themselves punk on a flyer in 1970. And they all sound, Television and Suicide and Blondie and New York Dolls all sound really different from each other. And then that influenced a scene that coalesced in the UK, obviously around the Sex Pistols and the Clash and that. But the thing about that 70s punk thing is everyone who saw a punk show in the 70s went and started a band.
Yes.
There are so many, and just to talk about the most famous bands is to get punk upside down, because the most important punk bands are the ones you were in, or your mates were in, or you saw down the end of your road, because it's absolutely about that grassroots kind of DIY, almost folk culture.
I mean, Steve, is this how you interpret punk?
I'm not a big punk guy, but I have recently been reading a biography of Madness, and they were talking, Suggs was talking about how he went to a punk gig in Camden in like 1976, and then there is actually a link to the Ska thing that happened straight afterwards, because they went to see all these punk bands in like the Dublin Castle and places like that, which meant they sort of were inspired to like start their own band. And then the original singer, John Hazler, was kind of punky, a bit more sort of like much more Clash type singer, and then they replaced him with Suggs because he wasn't available one day because of a job. And then they sort of heard about the Specials, and then they followed that, and then they went on the Two-Tone tour. And it is all linked, isn't it? I mean, it sort of goes off. I know their influences are more like from Jamaica and Ska and Jimmy Cliff and stuff like that,
but
it's
that's
linked.
Don Letts, who was the DJ at the Roxy, because
Alan
before Campbell. In 1976, 77, there weren't many punk records. 76, no punk records to play. So it's not until the Damned and the Pistols start putting stuff out. So he would play reggae, he would play dub stuff.
Yeah, and they buy it. And what's funny is what I loved about reading that book was the old haunts, because I moved back to London in the late 80s as a teenager, and they talk about going to like Cheapo Records and the secondhand record shops in Rupert Street. And I'm like, oh my God, I worked there. I worked in a hardware store on Brewer Street. And I used to get every pay packet I would go and buy secondhand records from those stalls and those shops. And it was like wonderful to hear about them like 10 years before that or whatever. It was like, and it was all still there. That's kind of what I loved about that sort of scene. Like it kind of kept going for so long. Yeah. Well, a bit underground, but it was around.
Well, it is apt that we are talking about the punk scene of London from 1977, because my two guests have brought in their comic strip panel selections, and I've got to say that one selection is going to be more familiar to most of us than another one is. So I'm going to start with what I think is the more familiar suggestion. I'm going to begin with us having a look at the panel that Steve has brought in. Now, before we dive in, guessing at what on earth it might be, for the benefit of the listeners at home, if you're listening just with your ears, this is on the show notes, this is on the artwork for the podcast episode, and if you're watching on YouTube, well, watch. But you don't have to worry about any of that, because Andrew O'Neill is now going to describe what we're all looking at. Andrew?
Imagine a more grizzled Tom Baker.
Who I served in that shop I talked about earlier, by the way.
It's a small world.
Yes, yeah. So imagine Tom Baker's head, but with a flatter nose and a squarer jaw, and then there's a sort of there's armor, and there's So he's wearing armor, and it's got a nice rounded 70s feel to it, and then there's a huge in quite sort of a brilliant perspective. There's a gun. There's a laser gun that's kind of it's coming out the panel, and it's also crossing over into another panel, producing a wonderful 3D effect. He's got a stripy top underneath his armor. It looks like another gun in a holster, and he's saying, "Drop those guns, or I drop you." In what I can only imagine is a grizzled voice.
It's got to be a grizzled voice. For the benefit of the people who study line art and technique, the panelologists, I can tell you this is drawn with line on paper. It's from the days before any Photoshop or any such technology, and it's done with a scratchy pen. I always thought this artist used a brush, but subsequently I discovered that this artist, who we in the comics biz all know well, used a little scratchy dip pen, or rotring repeatograph pen, in fact it was, with an even-sized nib, and scribbled with it. The character has got very thick curly hair. The Tom Baker comparison I hadn't thought about, but yes, this character, who I'm very, very familiar with, has thick curly hair. And that gun, I mean, could it be more phallic? It really is. There's an awful lot of, I don't know, homoerotic coding, isn't there, in the padding on the shoulders, because it's very leathery, not metallic, is it? This sort of quasi armor the character's wearing.
Yeah.
Pre-Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Before, of course, Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
So I'm getting, I get a bit of Paul Michael Glaser vibe from him too. A little bit of that, a little bit Starsky.
Starsky and Hutch look, of course, because Andrew, if you want to tell us more, you could go so far as to tell us, and I think you know, what we're looking at.
Well, I have to. I'm not the comic book nerd that people assume. So I'm guessing this is from 2000 AD. Would I be correct there, or is it 2000
Steve?
AD adjacent?
Yeah, it is from 2000 AD.
Okay, I don't know who the character is, but it very much looks to me like that British 2000 AD style. So I got that right. So who is it? Is this Sonny Alpha from the top left corner?
Oh, right. The word that's just cut off in the top left-hand corner is Johnny Alpha. Steve, while I pull it out from a pile beside me, would you like to tell us all what the comic is that we're looking at?
Well, it's from 1978, and it is a crossover comic where the character of Star-Lord was brought into the 2000 AD universe, if for want of a better word. And it's something I do it's basically from October 1978, which would have been the month of my birthday. Has he got that actual one? Of course he has. Look at it.
That is the actual comic. It's on the shelves behind me. If you're watching this on YouTube, this should fill your screen now. And I'll just show you the page
NP
that we were looking at.
There we are. Look at that. He's got it. Of course he has. Right.
The comic strip is called Strontium Dog. It is written by John Wagner, under the pseudonym T.B. Grover that he used at the time, and it is drawn by Carlos Ezquerra. So, Steve, this is from your childhood, right?
I'm not a big comic nerd at all, but there was a time I lived in Ireland when I was 8 when this comic would have come out, and I didn't really buy comics, but one of the few things my father used to get me were these comics, and he would bring them home. Every 2 weeks, every week? When were they?
Every week.
Every week. And I can't believe how cheap they were. 10p. Everything was 10p, wasn't it? The bus, the crisps, everything was 10p. But yeah, I used to really look forward to these comics, and they were sort of a bit of a solace for me in Ireland. I'd moved from London to Ireland as a London kid, and I was suddenly out in the middle of nowhere in a very rural part of Ireland.
Whereabouts?
It was in Tralee, actually, outskirts of Tralee and Kerry. And we lived in this very old building called Lamb House, which was hundreds of years old. And if there were ghosts, they would have been there. I would have seen them. So I don't think they exist. This was like a really, really old sort of stables turned into flats. And I just remember that being the thing I would look forward to most every week.
Whose doorbell just went? Was it Andrew?
Fine. I'm going to have to run downstairs. Apologies, 1 second.
That's okay. We'll pause.
The doorbells.
We'll pause the 2000 AD chat. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause the actual recording.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, all good.
In Ireland, in Tralee, you say?
Yeah, so we'd moved from this town called Listowel, which was a very small town, 17 and a half miles further north, because I remember the signpost. And we moved into this very old stables turned into flats. And I never had like a great relationship with my dad. In fact, he was quite abusive. But the only thing that he did that was nice that I can really remember is bring me these magazines. And I think in some way to say sorry for maybe his anger and things like that. So for me, they've always been 2000 AD has always been that. It's been that sort of, you know, a sort of home, an escape. You know, we didn't even have videos then, did we? What do you have? I remember watching the Hulk on TV. Used to watch the Hulk on TV, the Muppet Show, and read 2000 AD, and that was it. That was my escape. You know.
Well, yeah, this comic is from October 1978.
Yeah, yeah.
And have you kept the original issues?
No, I never got to keep them. I think they all got. There was some Marvel comics that arrived soon after we moved house, and then I got a lot of Captain America. And I used to draw a bit like, not like you, obviously, Kev, but I used to draw really well, like freehand. And I draw Captain America really well. And I don't know if you want this on here, it's a bit dark, but I remember really enjoying drawing and really enjoying drawing cartoon panels and making up my own stories. And then one day when I was about 9, my dad turned to me and he said, "Why are you still drawing?" And I was like, "Well, I really, really enjoy it." He goes,
No.
"Well, you've already got as good as you're going to get. Why bother with that? Just do something else. It's a waste of your time." And I was like, "Huh?" So we got all the comics and they all got taken to somewhere and given to other kids in the family as all these things happened. So
That is traumatic.
it's a bit dark, isn't it? But I moved on to Hardy Boys mystery books after that, which I hid under my bed. But yeah, I never really had the comic pile from childhood kept or anything like that.
Well, there's an anti-art feeling that runs through a lot of culture, and I've always pinned it in English culture to it being this Protestant culture who, once upon a time, you know, took all the pictures out of the churches. But of course, you were in a Catholic country there with someone doing exactly the same thing. So that blows my theory.
My parents were never religious in any way, in that way. I'm grateful for that part. But I was the only Protestant sent to a Catholic school in Tralee, and I was told to lie about my religion so I didn't get chucked out. So there was a little bit of oppression in that way. But at home, it was just, it was weird. You know, they used to teach me in the middle of the night. My mum would keep me up really late and homeschool me occasionally, teaching me very long words. And it was all very academic. And neither of them were ever academic.
But 2000 AD and comics weren't seen as part of that education. Ironically, because Strontium Dog is very much about outsiders in culture. It's very much about somebody who's been ostracized because they're mutants. And Andrew, you never came across these things.
So it's quite interesting, really. One of my regrets is not getting 2000 AD when I was a kid. There's a kid called Bobby who's at the end of his garden. Met the bottom of my garden, and he every day, so every week he'd walk past with his copy of 2000 AD. I bought one once on my way to a holiday in Mallorca or something, and there was a strip in it about a kid who had I think telekinetic abilities, and he was being bullied. But the bullies, there was a point where one of the bullies said, "I'm gonna hammer a needle into your big toenail," but it's because it's a needle, no one will ever see it and no one will ever believe you. And I just remember being so traumatized by this incredible sadistic act of violence. I kind of went, "Oh, I don't think this is for me." Now subsequently, so I got the Beano, and I loved the Beano. And up until a couple of years ago, I got a Beano annual every year. And just over there is I've got about 5 years worth of Beanos collected. And I loved it. And one of the things I particularly like now, I saw a thing just yesterday, where the Bash Street Kid's Fatty's now called Freddie.
Yeah.
And the Daily Mail did some spoof of it, and then the Beano just put this panel saying, "We're led by our wonderful readers," and I utterly love that, because I remember when they did a really good bit of PR, and they said that we're going to update Dennis the Menace, and he's going to wear a baseball cap, and he's going to, And what, in the story, he tries a new look and then hates it and immediately puts his red and black jumper back on. And it was a great thing because they're going, oh my God, they're doing this. And of course, it was never the plan.
Yeah. The Beano have been really good with PR and really good with confronting society. They had Walter's dad. Walter is no longer called Walter the Softie, but Walter's dad, they wrote an official letter asking William Rees-Mogg to stop imitating Walter the Softie. And it got such amazing coverage because this was at the time of the Boris Johnson government. You put the two pictures of them side by side, Walter the Softie, Rees-Mogg, snap.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's gorgeous. And then much later, so I would have been 22, 23, I just started doing stand-up. And I saw the film From Hell, the film adaptation of Alan Moore's From Hell. And I really liked it. I'm a big Hammer horror fan. So just there's my Peter Cushing tattoo. As Frankenstein, and I've got my Plague of the Zombies tattoo, and I really love. Yeah, there we go.
I've just spotlit the image. So, YouTube viewer, have a look at that Plague of the Zombies tattoo.
That's Ben Harris from Plague of the Zombies. And I got the Wicker Man in there. Obviously, Wicker Man's not Hammer, but that's Peter Cushing as Baron Frankenstein. Wow. So I watched From Hell and quite into the Victorian era, and I enjoyed it. And then Mike Belgrave, old stand-up comedian who's on the sort of open mic circuit that does, as I was at the time, said, "Oh, you've got to read the book." So I read From Hell, which remains the greatest book I've ever read. And I got immediately deeply into Alan Moore. And in the back of From Hell is an appendix where he explains everything he's doing. And he said, you've got to read it with 2 bookmarks. So I just went, well, this is the best thing ever. And it was this doorway into things like William Burroughs and into Robert Anton Wilson, psychogeography, occultism, magic. I am an occultist because of that. I then subsequently, read everything I could find of Alan Moore's and went, hey, maybe I think I really like comic books. Then I read some stuff that's not by Alan Moore, and it was a bit like doing Black Sabbath's cocaine and then doing something you buy from someone on the street. I kind of went, oh, no one else is as good. Okay.
Well, yes, of course. I was there when Alan Moore came in to 2000 AD comic, which was his big breakthrough. Steve, were you still reading when Alan Moore? Because we're talking about an issue from 1978. Yeah, Alan Moore starts appearing 79-80 with Tharg's Future Shocks. Or maybe it's a little later than that. And then his real breakthrough is when he does DR and Quinch and Halo Jones and Skiz for 2000 AD.
I definitely got back into it. Weirdly, circle back to a music reason. In 1985, Madness did a spin-off band called the Fink Brothers, and they released this song called Mutants in Mega City 1.
Oh, wow.
And that was like, there was Judge Dredd on the cover. I remember it very well. And I think it was just Suggs and Chaz Smash from Madness. And so that sort of sparked my interest again. I started reading it again. So that would have been about 1985. And I read it for a few years. That got me back in. And I was very excited by that. So I would have been reading around that time, definitely wasn't reading anymore by the time of the terrible film from 1992, I want to say.
Well, oh, you mean the Sylvester Stallone Judge Dredd film?
Yes, that was so terrible.
Yeah, the adaptation.
Unless you think it's good.
The adaptations of comics have obviously been a big deal as far as most American comics have been concerned for the last 20 years. 2000 AD, we had the Judge Dredd movie, 1995. Then we have Dredd, which has been in the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
There is a Rogue Trooper movie, has been directed by Duncan Jones and is supposedly ready to come out. And we're all waiting to find out about it.
It's animated, isn't it?
It is. It's. I think it's motion capture. Okay. Would I be right?
Yeah, right.
But Strontium Dog, who we have been talking about today, we're still waiting to see a Strontium Dog immortalised on the screen. If nobody's familiar with it, well, Steve, can you tell us about Strontium Dog?
I don't remember the reason I picked that one, in all honesty, Kev, is because it was around my birthday that time, and I really liked that panel, the way it looked. I don't remember much about the story, I must admit.
Well, just let me fill in anybody who's not familiar with Strontium Dog, created by John Wagner and Carlos Esquerra. He's a mutant, and we have an entire mutant universe where mutants are outcasts from society, and about the only job they can do is bounty hunters. And
Right.
over the period of these stories, and admittedly, I stopped reading these stories about 20 years ago. They do still continue, but they really explored this story with the whole fascist layer of the oppression of this underclass of society, as well as big science fiction adventures with incredible sci-fi concepts. Right at the beginning of Strontium Dog, he's using some things like there's this gun which grabs people and then zaps them forward in time, by which point the planet has moved on, so they're floating in space, so they
Oh
die.
wow,
I mean, I don't know why you
that's
don't just kill
so
them.
good.
That's the Red Dwarf joke, isn't it? Do you remember
Yeah,
that? Where
yeah.
they go back in time, but they're just back in time in their part of space, so they're still not in Earth.
So
Anywhere
many
near.
gags that we have subsequently seen in so
Yeah,
many other areas of science fiction.
yeah,
2000 AD got there
Yeah,
first, and in
yeah.
particular, writers like John Wagner and Alan Grant and Pat Mills, who would be the first generation, and then Alan Moore, who along a few years later, followed by Grant Morrison, Mark Miller,
I've got to mention
Garth
Steve
Ennis.
Moore. It's very important to mention Steve Moore.
Mustn't forget Steve Moore, sort of tangentially a friend of the podcast, because
Right.
there is a pilot, there is a bottle episode of this podcast, which is an interview that myself and my friend Steve did in 1982 with Alan
Brilliant.
Moore and Steve Moore.
Oh,
We're
I've got to dig
all
that
on the
out.
sofa
That's
together.
wonderful. So Steve, so I subsequent to getting really into Alan Moore, I then met him and befriended him, and so I interviewed him for a mate's fanzine in his house. Really got on with him, and also had friends. So my friends Tamsin and Joe were running comedy in Northampton, and so through several meetings. So you mentioned Damned Andrew, my radio sitcom. Alan Moore is the narrator of Damned Andrew, and the single greatest thing in my career was because I really love Alan Moore's spoken word stuff, things like the Highbury Working and Snakes and Ladders and stuff like that. And so I wrote these narrations in Alan Moore's voice and in his style, and then having Alan just getting the recordings back and hearing Alan Moore, who he's a friend of mine, but I'm still completely like intimidated by his absolute complete genius. You know, he's an incredibly friendly lover. Oh, you're right, how are you doing? But he's also just the greatest living writer. And the highlight of my career was getting these back. But also a thing I'm incredibly grateful for was at Alan's wedding I met Steve Moore and became friends with him, and I used to go down to Shooters Hill and he would take me on walks. So the walk that Alan talks about in Unearthing, Steve took me on that, and Steve would come up to North London and I take him on. So we do this sort of psychogeographical walks, and he's so vastly underrated in comic books generally, but also in the influence on Alan. Not just the influence of like literally teaching him how to do a panel and that sort of thing, but things like From Hell. So much of the information about London, the psychogeography and all that sort of thing, is Steve. That's Steve's research. That's Steve's input. And he was a beautiful and incredibly gentle guy. He had no ego. And no ego. He had a little bit of an ego. He was incredibly humble, and it just incredibly cool, and possibly the smartest person I've ever met. He was just he was wonderful, and that's an absolute privilege to have had a few years of friendship with Steve.
How great to have an opportunity to remember the late Steve Moore and Alan Moore, and all the things provoked by having a look at Strontium Dog from 2000 AD. And now I think we should have a look at what Andrew's brought in.
Yeah.
Right, listener at home, you'll find this in the show notes, the usual places. If you're watching YouTube, just open your eyes, and you shouldn't need to be able to see these images because Steve Otis Gunn is going to describe what we're looking at.
Okay, from what I can see, if I can make it out correctly, we're looking at, I can see the torso of a person with, you can see the arms, and they're wearing a sort of almost like striped sleeves, like a very fine striped sleeves. They're holding a giant sort of rectangular gun at themselves, and looks like they've basically shot themselves. There's a big black hole where the rest of their body should be, and above it in the bubble it says "Over the Stars."
Now, can I say that I'm seeing something different? I'm seeing someone who's tilting their head down. That big black star shape is their hair, and below that we see their clenched eyes, and then pointing down we see their nose. The triangular shape pointing down is their nose, and that's the ear to the left-hand side of the picture. Are you seeing that now, Steve?
I am. Is it a Rorschach test or whatever it is?
I guess we've
I feel like I'm in
sort of
therapy, and they're actually saying, "Okay, right, you got suicidal tendencies." No, yeah, I can see that sort of like almost like a bird face, almost, isn't it? Like almost like a beak.
very beaky face. For the benefit of people who study line and technique, it's a black and white line drawing. We can see the texture of the lovely, lovely paper as well, which is a matte newsprint paper rather than anything glossy. So no colour added, no colour attempted at all. We see the hand holding the gun pointing towards the head. I thought I knew what this was from.
Yeah.
But because of Andrew disavowing any knowledge of 2000 AD, I was clearly wrong. Steve, would you like to have a guess where it could be from?
I literally have no idea. I did try and sort of prep for this, but this doesn't look like anything. I mean, maybe people that would know would be able to tell from the text style, maybe because all capital letters, quite spiky. I couldn't even hazard a guess.
That's a good point. It is a handwritten voice bubble, probably dating back to the days before voice bubbles being done in Photoshop, Illustrator, and the other programs we use. I'll tell you what I thought it was. I'm holding up to the screen a copy of 2000 AD with a character called Bradley by Simon Harrison, which is what I thought this was. But clearly it isn't.
No.
So, Andrew, would you like to tell us what it is?
Yeah, I really love the fact that we've both had panels with guns in, and they couldn't be more different, could they? They couldn't be more contrasting.
No, this bar is like a rectangle. It could be a chocolate bar. It could be a book.
3D printed.
Yeah. And it's turned on himself. So this is issue 1 of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac by Jonan Vasquez. So people may know Jonan Vasquez from Invader Zim. That's the big thing he did. But this is the first, I think this is the first comic book he did. So in the very early 2000s, my mate CD, who I was in bands with, he was reading this and he said, he just thought I'd like it. And I did. I absolutely loved it. So John the Homicidal Maniac is a character. He's a goth, like he's a full-on goth with big spiky boots and spiky hair. It's very much, I think, autobiographical. And John the Homicidal Maniac, and this is not the autobiographical bit, he is a serial killer. And he commits copious and elaborate murders. And he kidnaps people and he tortures people and he's always killing people. But he can't get caught and he doesn't know why. He keeps getting away with it. And inside his house, beneath his house, suburban American clapboard house, is a cellar, and the cellar is absolutely vast. And on one of the walls of the cellar is painted with blood. And Johnny knows for some reason he has to keep the wall painted. He has to keep the wall wet with blood. And eventually, over the course of the series, Lovecraftian, impossibly huge, vast, cosmic horror comes through that wall. And then after this, he did a comic called I Feel Sick, which features a character called Devi, who interacts a little bit with him, and then one called Squee. And Squee is a little boy who's actually in this episode. He's a little boy with awful parents. Who gets visited by Johnny, and then eventually Squee gets visited by aliens. And Squee is very cute, and Squee, by the time you get to that, his style has developed, and it's a lot closer to what we see in Invader Zim. But the style of Johnny is very scratchy and very chaotic. It's very controlled, and his things like his panel style is. there's one lesson I learned, I think, between good comics and bad comics. Was actually when I was reading Alan Moore's Swamp Thing.
Right.
So when Alan revived Swamp Thing, and I was reading it and thinking that this is, beautiful and wonderful, and I was reading it issue by issue. A friend had them, the originals, and then I read one, and what Alan Moore often does, and Jonan Vasquez is similar. They make you work. They don't spoon feed you everything. You can read not really knowing where you are, and then all of a sudden it'll tie up, and there's a sure hand on the tiller, really good storytelling sense. And this particular issue of Swamp Thing, I kind of went, well, this isn't very good, and then I looked at it, and it was the first one that Alan Moore hadn't written in that series.
That's the authorial hand. It's a really significant part. I similarly would be really snobbish about things not written by the writer who I'd grown to love.
Right.
And quite where it went wrong was hard to pin down.
Totally. And so, and I have a thing. I don't know if it's. I have ADHD. There are certain styles. So underground comics, I find very difficult to pass. I'll look and I don't know what I'm looking at. And like the Transformers movies, the CGI, I can't pass what I'm supposed to be looking at. And so particularly underground comics I don't particularly like because my brain doesn't process them effectively.
Right.
But Jonan Vasquez, you know where you are, you know where you're supposed to be. He's controlling your attention. You're reading things at the right time. You're passing things at the right time, and he will do a thing where it'll lead up to a double-page spread, and it's a really sure hand on the tiller in terms of using the page for storytelling.
It could be part of being a writer and an artist, because that was a big part of Alan Moore's stuff. When Alan and Steve were working on The Stars, My Degradation in Sounds newspaper, Steve was writing it and Alan was drawing it. So he starts off as an artist, essentially. Yeah. But then when Alan Moore is working with other artists, he's frequently starting off visually and making a lot of suggestions about where, like, for example, the page turn. Yes. He spoke a lot about this in fanzine articles at the time, about how writers before him hadn't really used the page turn, which of course the comics have this visual thing that they can do that you can hardly do. Well, you probably can't do in any other medium. No. You can wait until the reader has to pull it over, and then there's a big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that thing of using echoes, so using symmetry. And he will do a thing where the bottom right panel is quoted in the top left panel, so that as you turn the page, he talks about this in How to Write Comics. As you turn, he says the point at which you will lose a reader is when they turn the page. So if you make the panel resonate with the previous one, and I think that's a beautiful thing as well. And it's funny actually. I was reading these earlier on. And I now feel I've outgrown this comic. It was very much my early adulthood. It's a very silly. It's a very young adult, and I mean adult, because I was in my early 20s. But there's a thing, definitely around kind of goth culture. There is a sort of there's a gleeful childishness about them. And I suppose it's that sort of like, the kind of more goths that they have like teddy bears and stuff hanging from their backpacks and that sort of thing, even into their 20s. And that sort of, and I think these are great, but I think it's interesting when during your adulthood, you realise that you have developed and you have changed. And
isn't there also a nihilism? Because obviously Johnny, the homicidal maniac, appeals to someone to whom the title Johnny the Homicidal Maniac will appear. Totally. And there's a lot of those dark motifs in a lot of darker music, attractive to us when we're going through certain phases in our lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. But there's a real sense of humour going through it. And it's funny, that thing where the dark and harsh music I like is always stuff that takes itself extremely seriously. It's always very dry, like Scandinavian black metal. Doesn't have Venom, who I also adore. Venom, the not the Spider-Man villain, but the black metal band, the originators of the term black metal. British black metal very often, up until relatively recently, really has a sense of humour about it. So Venom have that kind of sense of humour, and I think there's something in comics where I don't know, that I suppose I have a sort of like I like something that aspires to be as absolutely as good as it can be, you know.
Well, yeah, Steve, when you were reading 2000 AD as a kid, it was the seriousness of it you would have liked. I mean, you wouldn't have liked it if it took the piss out of itself, or if you knew it was doing that.
I mean, it's interesting you say like different times of your life. So I would imagine that at that time, when I was reading 2000 AD, I was very much into sci-fi. Whatever was on the telly, whatever was in cartoons, it was big at the time, wasn't it? Battlestar Galactica and Blake Seven, all that sort of stuff. So as a kid, I wasn't yet exposed to the comedic sort of cartoons. Obviously, I'd read. I was pretty sure I was, in all the fan clubs of Whizzer and Chips and all that sort of stuff. The Dandy, the Beano, all that stuff. I read those, obviously. But then as I got older, I think I was drawn to more comedic stuff. And as an adult, obviously, South Park was huge, and Viz, the obvious mention of Viz, Simon's been around the house. They sort of brought the comedy with it, and then all that stuff seemed a bit too serious. And I tried to go back to it by reading like Philip K. Dick short stories and stuff like that. And it all just felt a little bit above my head. I'd moved past that. I wanted to laugh. So for me, comics all became about levity and laughter. And then the adult stuff all sort of kicked off around that time. So I was like in my element. I never liked The Simpsons that much, but South Park was, when that was on TV, that was like the perfect moment for me of like, what is this? This is made for me,
A lot of creators, I mean, Alan Moore's a very good example, do tend to move from their earlier funny stuff to the later, more serious stuff. I think there's a lot of that. I mean, the Oscars are a good example, that they don't take the funny stuff so seriously. They think you grow up into not being funny.
Yeah,
I think that's right. I think I have a thing, because I'm a comedian, I think I want my other things to not be comedy.
Yes.
I have a slight oily. So people, there are various comedy bands, comedy metal bands that I love Spinal Tap because it's absolutely incredible. But things like Steel Panther are kind of like they're sort of like self-conscious glam band, and I'd like my metal to be bone dry, dead serious, and I think that's why. I think because I want comedy. I don't know. It's funny. I adore Red Dwarf, and Red Dwarf's got some decent sci-fi ideas in it and that sort of thing. I like, I'm a big old school Doctor Who fan. I watch, I still watch it like following a football team through its ups and downs, but I always like Doctor Who most. I think when it's aiming at its most adult, and if I were to make Doctor Who, it would probably have the tone of like the early X-Files, which got some levity in it, but I would like a Doctor Who that of course that wouldn't be successful. So this is why I'm not going to be given Doctor Who to run. And I think it is. I suppose I have a church and state separation between comedy and the other stuff.
Well, comedians do have this with looking at other people's comedy. You appreciate the hell out of it, but you don't actually stand there in the back of the room laughing.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. You go. You're appreciating form, and absolutely.
It's interesting you mentioned those early X-Files because I tried to re-watch the X-Files from the beginning about 6 months ago. Okay. I didn't get that far, but I've spoken to a lot of people, because I do a podcast about television, who are kind of scarred by the X-Files. I was a little bit older when the X-Files was on. I was in my 20s, so it didn't scar me. But there are people that have that. For me, it would be Doctor Who. It would be scary Doctor Who's that would have got me. But I can see it now. It had horror elements in it that were way beyond whatever it was 9 o'clock on a Thursday night television. It's quite scary, actually. They did a really good job.
I love it. I think it's terrific. The early stuff, particularly. I mean, like a lot of things, they didn't have an end point in mind. So it loses its way, and that's the thing when when people don't know. So the way Russell T Davies writes Doctor Who in the Writer's Tale, he talks about how there's a particular thing with the Osterhagen key, and he's writing to he's exchanging emails with the editor of Doctor Who magazine, and he's saying, "Yeah, I don't know what the Osterhagen key is yet," and I'm reading this going, "That you can't write like that." Yeah,
Oh, don't watch Severance then. But they definitely need to have an ending, don't they, when they start these things? That's why limited series are the best things in the world, because it's over.
Well, Better Call Saul I consider to be the greatest TV show of all time, and the degree to which they stick the landing, and also the degree to which they don't cheat anything in that And I really, really appreciate that. Everything in Better Call Saul, the prequel to Breaking Bad, everything about the characters that's been established in Breaking Bad, they have to stick to and then write round it. And writing that treats itself so seriously, takes itself so seriously, takes the audience as intelligent and doesn't dick you about.
Yeah. I think we're hijacking Kev's comic thing to talk about telling.
Well, we've been very interestingly hijacking a couple of comics written by one group of people and talking about comics by other people. Alan Moore has had a fair suck of the sauce stick today, and more credit to him for butting in on everybody else's work. The comics we were looking at were Strontium Dog by John Wagner and Carlos Esquerra from 2000 AD in 1978, and Johnny the Homicidal Maniac by John and Vasquez from when?
1998 is when it was first published, the first issue. I've got reissues from 2001.
Well, thank you to my guests for bringing those in. Steve, Andrew, where can we find you on the socials? Steve?
I don't have personal socials anymore. I just do the podcast, so it's all at TV Times Pod. Everything's on there.
And the podcast is definitely called Television Times. It's not called All My Clothes Need Burning.
Be quiet, Kev. Be quiet. Yeah, we did swerve into adventure stories and travel, and then the algorithm said no. So we've gone back to Television Times recently. Wow. But yeah, we are sticking with that format, although the format is very, very loose.
And Andrew, where do we find you?
If you search engine Andrew O'Neill Comedy, you'll find me on various socials. I also have two podcasts. I have the Inadvisable Trapdoor, which is my hauntological cut up weird comedy podcast, and I have a heavy music podcast called Infected Voice, where every week my guest picks one of the greatest heavy albums of all time, and we veer everything from electronica and hip hop to obviously heavy metal and punk and that sort of thing. So yeah, those are my two, the Infected Voice and the Inadvisable Trapdoor.
You have been listening to Comic Cuts, the panel show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, leave a review if you can, and check out the archive of previous episodes. Stick around for a trailer at the end. My name's Kev F. You can find out more and buy my books at kevfcomicartist.com. Thank you once again to Steve Otis Gunn and Andrew O'Neill.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Kev.
Comic Cuts. We're looking at a panel, and we comprise a panel. There's a few of us, so the panel sees a panel, and we talk about the comics from the panel we discuss, and we call it Comic Cuts.